on our first Wiesenthal lecture this year, 2012. I'm very happy that you're here, and I'm honored to welcome Tim Cole from the University of Bristol for our lecture. Just a short introduction from my side. Whenever, as a managing director of the Wiesenthal Institute, I'm asked if there is anything to be researched, to be told, or to be written on the Holocaust, I always give a very general answer to that. For being not a Holocaust historian, I tell that the beautiful thing on history, I'm a contemporary historian, is that you have always new findings, that you have always new sources, and especially new approaches, new methods to tell the same story in a different way, and that is history. Now, having read 2 books of Tim Cole, I think he has published 3, I have a great help in not only giving a general answer to that questions to friends of mine, but I can give a very concrete answer to that. I can tell them about these books who kind of show me that you have a very new approach to something which is in a way, but not exactly, also documented, but it has a new approach and very innovative story to tell. It's about the way the ghettoization in Hungary happened and how normal people started to accept and how to accept the way ghettoization happened in Hungary. There are 2 books about the impact on the so-called Jews and the so-called non-Jews, about the process which has taken place in Hungary in 1944. In those 2 books, in Holocaust City and Traces of the Holocaust, Tim Cole tells us the history of the ghettos in Hungary using very different perspectives, sources, and approaches to describe the perpetrators, the bystanders, and the victims. But most importantly, for me at least, both books reveal a very specific view on the process of ghettoization in Hungary within the ordinary spaces of a city. They reconstruct the formation of a ghetto in a very empirical way, but also regarding the imagination of the relevant people involved in that process. Cole's book describes how the ghettos changed the minds and the perception of a whole society within a very short period of time. Whereas Tim Cole himself writes in one of my books, he says so, I take a group of ordinary men involved in municipal government in Budapest, Hungary, and try to get inside their heads as they implement ghettoization of the city's Jews during 1944. And I also try to get inside the heads of some of the non-Jewish neighbors living in the same apartment buildings as Jews restricted to the place of the ghetto in 1944. What I'm interested in is how something so ordinary as the very spaces and places of a city was manipulated during 1944 to create distinct Jewish and non-Jewish spaces. And there's one image on the front of the page, on the front of the book of Tim Cole, Holocaust City, which is kind of illustrating the thesis of Tim Cole. It's a very famous photograph of Evgeny Haidai, the Soviet-Russian photographer, and he shows us a couple in the streets of Budapest after the liberation, but they are still unable to tear off the humiliating mark of their distinction, the yellow star, which is a kind of a symbol for the whole book of Tim Cole, at least in my eyes. And I think after having read Tim Cole's books, you will never look at Budapest or any Hungarian city in the same way as you did before. Short introduction of Tim Cole. He teaches history at the University of Bristol. Besides the 2 books I talked about on the formation of the ghettos in Hungary, he also is author of Images of the Holocaust, Selling the Holocaust. And Tim Cole is currently working on a new book, which he calls Holocaust Landscapes, that explores the places and spaces where the Holocaust was enacted, experienced, and evaded, and has been variously remembered and forgotten in the post-war period. He also is involved in an international research group that applies geographical methodologies in studying the Holocaust. Please welcome Professor Cole. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Bela, for the invitation and for a very generous introduction, I should make notes. I should take the copy, and then I realize what it is that I've been writing about these last 10 years. What I want to do in this paper is to try and bring together some of the work that I've already done and introduce a little bit some of the new directions that I've started to move, in particular working with a geographer from the United States, who I'll show you later. I start with an overly long quotation. It's the only one, and I apologize, but it's something that I've always been struck by. It's from a book which Yad Vashem and Yivo published back in 1960. It's one of the pioneering historians of the Holocaust, sadly cut short in his prime, Philip Friedman, who suggested that historians might want to pay attention to ghetto maps if they were interested in trying to understand this particular aspect of the final solution. And as you can see, he went into considerable detail about what kinds of things scholars might look for. A comparison of the ghetto maps with the city maps can help the student to decide whether there was a Nazi master plan to locate the ghettos in the periphery of a town, in its dilapidated and overpopulated suburbs, or in those sections which were destroyed by military operations. A comparison of the ghetto area with the Aryan section of a town will show the relationship between density of population and available living space for Jews and non-Jews, and thus reveal a pattern of overcrowding of the Jewish ghettos. A study of the ghetto and city maps will indicate whether gardens, squares, and other recreation areas were permitted in the ghetto area. This does not exhaust their usefulness. They also reveal a particular feature of Nazi ghetto planning, the simultaneous creation in several towns of 2 or even 3 ghettos, with either no communication between them or very little. The maps also show the frequent changes the Nazis made in the ghetto areas, almost all of which were meant to worsen the existing facilities, narrow the available space, or move the inmates to new sites. Now, I quote those words because, in a sense, those are the kind of ideas that I think have been echoing in my own head for the last 10 years as I've been working on ghettoization in Hungary. In a sense, I don't think I've got any further, perhaps, than the kinds of ideas that that's found in this extraordinary book published back in 1960. What I want to do this evening is to introduce you, first of all, to a couple of maps that I want to analyze and think about how they might shed some light on what happened so quickly within the Hungarian context in 1944. And then to introduce you to some new work, which is work where I'm involved in map making myself, and geovisualization, and also spatial analysis of ghettos. And that's where I want to suggest that perhaps geography has something to contribute to Holocaust studies more generally. Now, some maps do survive from 1944 that have been drawn up by Hungarian officials, identifying where to place a ghetto in the town or city. This is perhaps the most famous of the maps from Hungary. It's the one from Budapest, the Pest ghetto, set up in the winter of 1944. Where we've got more maps is from a county called Tolna County in central Hungary, where a complete set of the maps of all the ghettos that were established there in May 1944 survive. And what I want to start off is by looking at 2 of those maps, really looking at them in order to explore broader issues of importance in understanding what I think are the social histories, or the socio-spatial histories of the implementation of concentration and deportation of Hungarian Jews so late on in the war, after the German occupation of its reluctant ally. But most of the 150 or so ghettos in Hungary appear not to have been mapped out cartographically, or at least if they were, these maps haven't survived. Most ghettos were delineated textually in ghetto orders, which simply listed the names of the streets and the houses that were to be part of the ghetto. And that's where I want to shift in the second part of the lecture, to try and think a little bit about what's the value of visualizing these textual sources, if you like, actually drawing maps on the basis of these documents. And here I work on collaborative work undertaken with a geographical information scientist based in Texas, a guy called Alberto Giordano. I felt like we should have his presence here in some way, even if only visual. It's been an interesting experience for me of working with a GI scientist, someone who in many ways speaks a different language to the language of a historian. It's been a real challenge and I think also opportunity of interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary writing. And in the second half of the lecture, what I want to do is introduce you to some of the maps that Alberto and I have created over the last year or so, and to try and think about what kinds of conclusions those have suggested, in particular about reframing the way that I think about the ghetto in Budapest. But let's start in Tolna County, and our first map from a place called Hirjesh, where a clerk in May 1944 sketched out a map of the city, and in particular the two broad ghetto areas that you found in the city. One up here, one a little bit further up. Now, he didn't do this on his own initiative, but he did this because he'd been asked to by the county prefect, who was involved in issuing an order on the 11th of May 1944, which did a number of things. The first part did what any ghetto order issued by county officials did, which was to say which towns and cities were to have ghettos. And then the second order gave a whole lot of detailed things that needed to be taken into account. If you like, it gave the nitty-gritty of constructing and guarding and running a ghetto. Point number 28 in a very long list of very detailed instructions ordered the local authorities to provide 4 copies of a name list of Jews living in each of the ghetto houses, along with 2 copies of a ghetto map, and hence we have these maps being drawn up. Now, this call for multiple copies of name lists and maps reflects the breadth of distribution of this paperwork to those that the county prefect thought were interested parties. The local town council and the chief constable of the district got both the name lists and a map. Jewish house commanders responsible for ordering the house day to day, the cleanliness, the inside of each house got a copy of a name list, and so did the rural police force, the gendarmerie, or in cities, the urban police district station. Now, armed with both with the map and the name list, local officials were able to pinpoint the exact whereabouts of Jews in May and June 1944. As the English social historian Patrick Joyce notes of a very different time in a very different place, the modern map is essential to power and to the practices of rule. Ghetto maps and their accompanying name lists were instruments of territoriality, the exercise of power with the help of maps through spatial control. The local authorities knew where any of the 5,000 Jews in this county were at any one time, which was particularly important in a place where, with 8 places having ghettos, there were a few too many ghettos. But this map from Hirjesh was very unusual. It was the only one of the 8 maps from this county which, in a sense, provided both names and the visualization of where people lived, or at least in the case of just one individual. Drawing up the ghetto map here, the clerk carefully mapped out the temporary residence of one man, Dr. Lajos K. He's on the map, and he's on its accompanying key. He's the only individual named on any of the county maps from Tolna. Everyone else was just in the name lists. But Dr. Lajos K was exceptional. He lived temporarily, at least, outside the ghetto, rather than in one of the ghetto areas carefully delineated on the map. He was a Jew living outside rather than inside a ghetto. But his whereabouts was still under the control asserted through mapping. Now, his place on the map was a result of his profession. He was a medic. It's not surprising to find a Jewish doctor in a town like Hirjesh in 1944. In the 1930s, over half of all doctors in Hungary were Jewish, with the proportion much higher in towns and cities outside of Budapest. Now, this perceived overrepresentation of Jews in the medical profession drew the ire of radicals in the 1930s who pressed for limits on the number of Jewish doctors in the interwar period. But once ghettoization got underway, large numbers of Jewish Hungarian communities reliant on Jewish doctors faced a real dilemma. In the city of Nagyvárad in Transylvania, local officials reported that placing Jewish doctors into the ghetto there had, I quote, temporarily aggravated the healthcare situation in the city, and you find this complaint echoed elsewhere. In Hirjesh, and it seems that it wasn't the only place, a temporary local solution was adopted, which allowed Dr. Lajos K. to live and carry on working outside the ghetto. He may well have been the only doctor in this town by the early summer of 1944, and so the segregatory logic of ghettoization was pragmatically done away with to ensure that the sick in the town could continue to see a doctor. But despite these local solutions and local murmurings, national officials took a very hard line. On the 23rd of June, when Jews across the country were housed in ghettos or had already been deported, national legislation was issued forbidding Jewish doctors from treating non-Jewish patients. And Laszlo Endre in the Interior Ministry in Budapest consistently rejected calls that Jewish doctors be spared from the deportations to Auschwitz. On the map, Lajos K's place outside the ghetto was clearly marked as temporary, and temporary it continued to be. But other Jews were removed much more permanently from ghettos like this one in Hirjesh. What the map doesn't show, but what does emerge quite clearly when you look at the accompanying name lists, is that ghettos in Hungary were highly gendered spaces. Now this is true across Europe. Ghettos tended to have majority female populations because of the call-up of men into labor in places like Poland in the earlier period. But it's particularly striking in Hungary given the call-up of Jewish men to labor service in 1941. Then Jewish men aged between 20 and 42 were called up to serve in auxiliary labor service battalions for a period of 2 years, something that Randy Brahim has written about. In what can be seen, I think it was almost a compromise of sorts. Jewish men were to serve in the army, but were not to serve in an armed position. They were sent to the Eastern Front where they suffered very high casualty rates in this period. But this story of labor service as gendered threat to Jewish men changed dramatically in the early summer of 1944. Not only did the Ghettoization decree, when it was issued at the end of April 1944, explicitly exempt Jewish men already serving in labor battalions from being placed into ghettos, but as Ghettoization was implemented, new waves of conscription took place. And this was a cause of concern to Gendarmerie Lieutenant Colonel Laszlo Ferenczy, who oversaw the concentration and deportation process. He wrote a series of reports to his superiors in Budapest where he complained about Jewish men being removed from the ghettos and transit camps by the Hungarian military that he was supposed to be overseeing. As a result of these call-ups, hundreds and hundreds of Hungarian Jewish men were removed from ghettos that had not yet been liquidated. Instead of being deported, Jewish men in their late teens, 20s, 30s, and even into their 40s served out the war in labor battalions. So prior to the arrival of Hungarian Jews at the ramp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, if you like, a pre-selection had already taken place within Hungary. The Hungarian state had already selected those Jews, young adult men, that it saw as fit for labor. And the end result was that the Jews arriving at Auschwitz-Birkenau from Hungary in the late spring and early summer of 1944 were mainly children, women, and the elderly. And I think you can see that from a couple of visuals. This is taking the name lists from the ghettos in Veszprém, one which is for the city's Jews and one which is from rural Jews. And what I've done is black is female, white is male, and you can see the age categories along the bottom. So 0 to 9, starting with children on the left, ending up with 80 plus years here. And you can see these massive inequalities between male and Jewish numbers, in particular in the third one along, which is 18 to 29 years, the middle one 30 to 42, 43 to 49, and then it starts to lessen once you get to 50 and 59 years. That's from Veszprém. What's interesting, I think, is this is from Kernel, another place in West Hungary, where you see essentially the same pattern. So this same pattern of very high numbers of women, of children and the elderly being placed on the deportation trains from ghettos like this. The death rates of Hungarian Jews at Auschwitz were so high in large part, I think, because adult males were not on the deportation trains. The Hungarian state saw Jewish men as far too valuable to offer to the German state. Jewish women were another matter entirely. As Randy Brahim has reflected, it's one of the ironies of history that the Ministry of Defense, which had been viewed as one of the chief causes of suffering amongst Jews during the previous 4 to 5 years, suddenly emerged as the major governmental institution actively involved in the saving of Jewish lives in the summer of 1944. But his claim that, I quote, "It's safe to assume that many local commanders, aware of the realities of the Ghettoization and deportation program, and motivated by humanitarian instincts, did everything in their power to rescue as many Jews as possible," remains, I think, relatively unsubstantiated across the country as a whole. I'm more convinced by his signalling of far more pragmatic motivations as a result of the manpower shortages faced by Hungary in this period. Certainly for Christian Ungvari, this is more critical. He writes, sparing the Jews certainly was not the intention of those Hungarians responsible, but rather exploiting Jewish work power and expertise, and he notes in particular physicians and pharmacists, for free and for as long as possible. And here, I think, is a link between the two ghetto areas. We'll just see if this... We ended up getting stuck. Should I do Control-Alt-Delete or something? I'm not a Mac user. Great. Perfect, thank you. Here's a link, I think, between the two ghetto areas on the Hirjesh map being gendered spaces and the marking on the map of the temporary residence of Dr. Lajos K. Because both medics and Jewish men from their teens through to the late 40s were seen to be far too valuable to place behind ghetto walls. Here's evidence, I think, of the opportunism and economic pragmatism that others, in particular Gabor Kardar and Zoltán Várgy, have seen as characterizing the implementation of the Holocaust in Hungary, and something that I've pointed to in my own work, which leads me on to our second map from the town of Tolna. Sorry for the poor quality of this one in particular. It's a map that's striking to me because of the patchwork shape of the ghetto here, made up of a series of separate houses on this central spine of Árpád utca, and then a little outlying house on Szédressy utca. The ghettoization was dispersed here, and also dispersed to a lesser extent in Hirjesh, is not maybe that surprising. Because in the national legislation, when they ordered ghettoization in Hungary, the practical details of where ghettos were to be set up was left to local officials who, it was thought, knew the situation on the ground better. They could place Jews into individual houses, they could place Jews into specific streets, they could place Jews into entire closed sections of a town or city. What the national legislation made clear was that there were two core principles. Jews were to be concentrated and Jews were to be segregated. But what a ghetto looked like was left to local officials. In this case in Tolna, they chose a series of individual buildings. Now what's clear, I think, is when you look at other documents from the archives, is that in Tolna this patchwork ghetto was created in order to minimize the impact of segregation on the non-Jewish population of the town. Because ghettoization, especially at the scale of a section of the city, was something that meant not only that Jews had to move into a ghetto area, but also that non-Jews had to up and leave. And in Tolna, and they're far from alone in this, officials clearly sought to minimize the need for non-Jews to relocate by neatly sidestepping non-Jewish owned houses on Árpád utca. It's true, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit later with Budapest, that private property rights, in a sense, in Hungary shaped ghettoization rather than being reshaped by it. And one way to achieve this was to use Jewish-owned buildings. In Tolna, 8 of the 9 ghetto houses were Jewish-owned. But another way, and this is something you see elsewhere as well, was to get rid of the use of residential property entirely, to use non-residential, often governmental property. In Tolna, as well as making use of 8 Jewish-owned houses, the local authorities also used a former gendarme barracks at Árpád utca 7. It was this building that formed the very heart of this patchwork ghetto. It explains why Árpád utca, rather than any other street in the town, was chosen as the main spine for this ghetto. The attraction of this gendarmerie barracks, which was now empty and owned by the state, was that it was huge, massive compared to the small family houses that you found within this particular community. Once the ghetto was established, 128 Jews, about a third of the total within this ghetto population, were housed in this one building alone. And what that did was it kept the number of Jewish houses to a minimum, which fitted with concerns expressed by the deputy prefect when offering clusters of houses or freestanding buildings where local conditions made this necessary. It seems that size mattered. Ghettoization was seen quite clearly as spatial concentration as well as spatial segregation. And this is something that I want to return to again when I look at Budapest. Segregation in ghettos like that in Tolna, which were relatively dispersed, worked in multiple ways. Not only did segregation mean that Jews were separated from non-Jews, but in dispersed ghettoization, Jews were also separated from other Jews. Because in Tolna, each of these individual ghetto houses were in reality micro-ghettos, separated out from both other ghetto houses and non-ghetto houses. The house at Árpád 12 housed 4 extended families brought together under the auspices of ghettoization, with 1 extra person to make up the numbers, living 1 family to a room, sharing a kitchen and a bathroom. And although the neighbouring house was also part of the dispersed ghetto, this was an entirely separate place. The 18 Jews living at Árpád utca 12 in May and June 1944 were in reality cut off not only from non-Jews in the town, but also to the Jews that lived right next door to them in another ghetto house. There were some limited opportunities for exchange. 1 woman from the house regularly left to shop with 17 other Jews from their ghetto houses across the town between 10 and 12 on market days. Other women left the house more sporadically, as was the case elsewhere, to do agricultural work in forced labour gangs. It was at moments like these that there was the possibility for some kind of contact between Jews separated out into these micro-ghettos. But multiple and dispersed ghettos that were adopted in a number of places in Hungary, largely out of concerns to ensure that ghettoization didn't negatively impact the non-Jewish population, had the result, I think, and importantly, of separating Jews from other Jews, not just separating Jews from non-Jews. And this was most marked in the Hungarian capital, Budapest, where a very highly dispersed form of ghetto was created in the summer of 1944, initially made up of well over 2,000 houses, later reduced to about 1,900 houses. Just what I want to turn to think a bit more about. Now, predating this very dispersed form of ghettoization, officials in Hungary, in Budapest, had originally aimed for 7 ghetto areas in the city, marked in red on the map. A series here in Buda on the left-hand side of the city, 3, and then 4 in Pest, including a large central ghetto area in the 6th and 7th districts of the city. What I think is interesting about these plans from May 1944, and this is something that I look at great length in Holocaust City, was at this stage, ghettoization was seen to be not only placing Jews in certain places in the city, which were in high-rent, poor-quality apartment buildings largely owned by Jews, but clearing Jews from certain places in the city, which were high-prestige, high-status properties, along a series of major boulevards and squares in the city. But these plans from early May 1944 came to naught. Instead, they were replaced with a much more dispersed form of ghettoization that was ultimately adopted in the middle of June 1944. Jews were to live throughout all districts of the city, but were to be restricted to 2,500 specified apartment buildings. It's about 2,639, largely those already owned by and lived in by Jews. They're marked on the map with red and also with green, and as you can see, they really are spread out right across the city. There's clusters in that central district, 6th and 7th district, up in the 5th district as well, but it's a very highly dispersed form of ghettoization. Now, I think this degree of dispersion was largely the result of the concerns that I've mentioned in Tolna, a concern with limiting the number of relocations of non-Jews by focusing, if you like, on Jewish-owned and Jewish-lived-in properties. But even though I think the plan quite clearly did this, it was a plan that met with immediate and very hostile resistance. The mayor of Budapest was overwhelmed with petitions from individuals protesting the specifics of this ghetto plan. The majority came from non-Jews who wanted their property to be removed from the ghetto list so they could stay put, or from Jews who wanted their property to be placed on the ghetto list so they could stay put. In both cases, what these individuals wanted was that ghettoization would not equal dislocation. You get a small number of petitions that argue for something quite different. There's a small number of non-Jews who see this as an opportunity for upward mobility and argue that their property should be placed on the ghetto list so that they can exchange for a better quality apartment somewhere else in the city, normally one that they've already scouted out and come to some informal arrangement about shifting to. But you also get another set of petitions which is interesting, I think. It's coalitions of Jews and non-Jews living in apartment buildings who call for a new status to be applied to the place where they live. Mixed status is the word that they coin. A building that can house both Jews and non-Jews. Now this furore, this hundreds of petitions that are sent to the mayor in the middle of 1944 resulted in a hasty week of door-to-door surveys being undertaken in the city to try and work out the precise proportion of Jews and non-Jews, leading on the 22nd of June to a new list of 1,900 ghetto houses, which included both cancellations and new designations. The red dots on the map are the ones that stay all the way through the period. The green dots on the map are the ones that are cancelled, largely, if you can see, in the peripheral areas, in the suburbs. The blue dots are the ones that are added, mainly in the 6th and 7th districts of the city. At the end of November 1944, two much more concentrated ghettos were established in place of the dispersed ghetto that existed through the summer and fall of 1944. One, the map that we saw right at the beginning, the Pest ghetto. Another, a more loosely designated area where Swedish and Swiss, Portuguese, Vatican protected Jews lived in the so-called international ghetto on the banks of the Danube close to the Margaret Island in a traditionally middle-class Jewish district called Uli Podvaras. Ultimately, in the case of Budapest, both of these ghettos are ones that are liberated rather than liquidated, as that photograph on the front of the book shows the Soviet photographer who took a photograph of Jews newly liberated from the Pest ghetto. Now, in earlier work on Budapest and Holocaust City, what I was interested in was these rapid shifts in the nature of ghetto plans and ghetto implementation that takes place across 1944. In particular, I was interested in trying to think about how mapping those out might get inside the heads of those that I called doctors of space, borrowing a term from Henri Lefebvre, those who were restructuring the residential space of the city along racialized lines in 1944. In particular, I was interested in highlighting the ways in which ghettoization seemed to be variously seen as a policy of clearing Jews away from places, if you like, creating Jewish absences, or putting Jews in certain places, if you like, creating Jewish presences. And shifts between the two that I identified in 1944 seemed to mark a shift away from a moment of almost utopian planning and concern about cleansing the city of its Jews to a much more pragmatic moment of doing ghettoization in the easiest way possible and with a greater concern for social economics. If you like, what I emphasized really was that ghettoization in this city looked very different across 1944, and that suggests that individuals planning it thought very differently about ghettoization. But I'm now not entirely sure about that idea. Now, in my earlier work, I did do some mapping, very basic mapping. This is of the 11th district of the city where I mapped the ghetto houses in June 16th, 1944. And then the ghetto houses, June 22nd, 1944, lo and behold, here's this kind of disappearance of houses from this peripheral suburban district in Buda. But in mapping out ghetto houses in Budapest in earlier work, I didn't take into account the variation in population density in a city that, as those of you who know Budapest, ranges enormously from very large apartment buildings in central districts to small family houses in the suburban periphery. Now, one way to try and represent this is to weight buildings by the number of residents, to try and capture that sense of different residential properties, different population density. It's not an easy job to do without going to the hard copy of individual census returns from the interwar period. So to overcome that, what Alberto and I have used published data from the 1941 population census that summarized population density by districts to then project values of residential density to Jewish designated residences within each district. And the maps I'll show you in a minute are all weighted, if you like, by trying to take into account the fact that not every ghetto house was the same size. Some were far bigger than others. Now, what's been interesting to me in doing that, and this I think is where working with a GI scientist has been in some ways revelatory for me as a historian, is that trying to take into account the different nature of building stock across districts suggests that the kinds of differences that I highlighted in earlier work maybe are ones that I would now underplay a little bit. I'll just talk you through this map, which is one of the maps that we created from the GIS. I should just explain what historical GIS is. Essentially, it's nothing more simple than creating layers of maps. You could do it with tracing paper. In this case, we do it with, on the computer. So essentially what you have is you have a historic layer of Budapest 1944, a historic layer which is all of the different ghetto houses from this period in 44, a layer of the street network, which is important, as I'll suggest in a minute, and then a series of layers of anything else that matters. So we thought market halls were important, we thought where the Swedish legation was important, we thought that hospitals were important that Jews could go to. So there's a series of layers, if you like, that you start to build up. Now the thing about doing it on a computer rather than doing it through a series of acetates or just pieces of paper is that it allows you to run a series of methods of spatial analysis. And in this case, what this map shows is it shows three different series of spatial analysis that we used across this 1 week in Budapest in 44, which in my earlier work was kind of the crucial week in some ways. This is like the fulcrum. This is where there's a final end to utopian ideological visions, and you get a much more kind of pragmatic social economic sense of ghettoization winning out. What we did is what we plotted is on the green, you can see a dot in the middle, which is the mean center. That's literally just the central point in the city where all of these 2,500 ghetto houses are. So it's, if you like, the kind of the locational, the center of gravity of where ghettoization was in Budapest. The green circle, which is a full circle, is something called standard distance, which is trying to encapsulate in some ways the degree of concentration and dispersion. You know, in some ways, by just putting one dot on the map, you don't really get a sense of how dispersed these houses are. And so that's a statistical method to try and undertake that. The one that is a hash line is called directional distribution, which is to try and show the kind of directional basis of these different ghetto houses. So how do they play out across the geography of a city as a whole? Are they mainly, if you like, stretch north to south or east to west in brief terms? And then what you see in purple is exactly the same spatial analysis, but done for a week later on the 22nd of June, 1944. Now, the obvious thing that you can see is that this is clearly about greater concentration. So suddenly, ghettoization in the city is becoming much more concentrated in this period. This week does mean, as you'd imagine, not only just less ghetto houses, but also less ghetto houses in the peripheries and more ghetto houses within the central areas. But what was really fascinating for me running this analysis was I expected the two dots in the middle to move much more than they did. They're in essence in the very same place. If you like, even though this looked like to me an incredibly turbulent week, you know, I was looking at petitions sent to the mayor, I was looking at a massive number of changing addresses, and I kind of felt like from the textual records, this felt like a really important week. Lo and behold, my spatial analysis suggested it was important for concentration, but in a sense it didn't really shift where the ghetto was in some ways, some important ways, or at least not the center of gravity of the ghetto in Budapest. Now, another way to signal this, and I think a more sophisticated way, is to do something called kernel density analysis. On the left, you've got June 16th. On the right, you've got June 22nd. The thing about kernel density analysis is that it tries to be less of a blunt instrument than just one dot to capture 2,600 points, that it's much more about gradations. So it's trying to, in some ways, suggest the gradations of shifts within the ghetto and where it was in the city in this particular period. Again, what struck me was, in a sense, things didn't change. The ghetto seemed to be in the same place. And in particular, it seemed to be in a place which is where Jews traditionally lived in the city, in the 6th, 7th, and 5th districts. Now, what was really striking was, in essence, I think what you find is, in some ways, a kind of continuity of the story that I told as a story of distant difference. So in Holocaust City, my whole argument was that look at these different changing shapes of ghettoization in the city. It's imagined as a series of ghetto places and clearing Jews. Then it's like 2,500 houses. Then it's just 1,900 houses. Then it's just 2 ghetto areas. In some ways, this started to disquiet me because it suggested actually that the center of gravity of ghettoization didn't really shift throughout this whole period. It stayed more or less the same. The 2 largest ghetto areas in the May plans were in the 6th, 7th, and 5th district. The Pest ghetto is in the 7th district, the International ghetto in the 5th district, and the centre of gravity of ghettoization across this turbulent week, which I'd made so much of, seemed to stay put. It was one of those moments of doing something different, working in an interdisciplinary way, where I suddenly started to question some of the assumptions that I'd made in earlier work, which was largely textually based. You know, as a historian, when you read hundreds and hundreds of petitions, you think they must matter. And then I started to question, well, maybe they didn't in some ways. Although I think what you do see here is you see, in some ways, the same argument that I'd argued in Holocaust City, but maybe reframed in a slightly different way. What seems clear in Budapest is that regardless of the very different shapes of ghettoization, that the constant idea remained that ghettoization was about taking the ghetto to the Jew rather than taking the Jew to the ghetto. Now, whilst ideology is surely part of that story, a kind of notion of the Jew's place in the city, I think what you see here is much more the persuasiveness of pragmatic concerns to avoid displacing non-Jews. Now, ultimately in Budapest, this desire to avoid displacing non-Jews led to a major concession being granted, which allowed non-Jews to remain living in these ghetto houses, these 1900 ghetto houses from 22nd of June onwards. If you like, this calls for mixed status, which had been articulated in some of those petitions that I'd spent hours read, was accepted by local officials. And it would seem that relatively large numbers of non-Jews did choose to stay put. The journalist Jenu Levai claimed that 12,000 non-Jews lived in ghetto houses, although his figures are really impossible to substantiate. But I don't think he's probably that way off the mark. Certainly in the area of the Pest ghetto, which we have got some paperwork about, 144 of the Yellow Star houses, there's 162 Yellow Star houses in this area, and 144 of them were mixed status houses, lived in by both non-Jews and Jews in the winter of 1944. In essence, it would seem that the more than 1,900 houses that made up the Jewish residences in Budapest throughout the summer and fall of 1944 were mixed houses. The scale at which the ghetto was implemented was at the scale in Budapest, ultimately, of the individual apartment. A scale which is very difficult to police. And in this context, I've come to rethink my sense of what ghettoization in Budapest meant on a day-by-day basis for Jews and non-Jews. Ghettoization during the Holocaust is generally thought of as simultaneously a process of concentration and segregation. But whilst concentration does seem to be the norm wherever ghettos were set up, the extent and the nature of segregation varied considerably from place to place. As I've suggested in Tolna, the segregation could mean Jews being separated from other Jews as well as from non-Jews. And in Budapest, I think this is all too true. What doing some more GIS analysis suggested was that the apartment building, the individual apartment building, becomes this crucial social space in terms of understanding the experience of Jews and non-Jews in the summer and fall of 1944. A place that Jews could only leave initially for 3 hours a day, later this was extended to more hours, and could only leave to go and do a certain number of prescribed activities, shop, go to hospitals, go to visit other Jewish inhabitants. But what GIS suggests is that there were really practical limits to where Jews could physically go in the city, given these temporal limits upon when they could leave their apartment. One of the first things we did was we plotted the 50 most isolated Jewish houses in the city, and what you find is a peripheral ring of Jewish houses that are in many ways separated out from other Jewish houses within this separate city. Secondly, we mapped out the market halls in operation in 1944 and looked at the walking distances to those market halls. The light colour in the centre is a 30-minute walking distance. The darker colour is a 60-minute walking distance, and you can see the houses that are outside of that. We did that as well for the Swedish legations, and which is just down here. Again, 30 minutes and 40 and 60 minutes, and then we did that as well for Jewish hospitals, where again you get a similar kind of pattern of houses that are inaccessible to these places. Taken together, I think these maps convey the extent and implications of dispersion within this ghetto that stretched across the city with houses designated in all 14 of the city's wartime districts. Visualizing ghettoization in terms of the time that it would physically take to walk from one place to another, your house to a crucial place to go, reveals the way, I think, that this ghetto can be seen very much as divided space. It was physically impossible to walk across the entire ghetto area, which stretched from east to west, north to south across the city, within the initial 3-hour period permitted to take that journey and return again. Naomi Gur, 14 in 1944, remembered having to run on her way back from the hospital in Buda, where she'd been taking kosher food to her mother to ensure that she got back to the Yellow Star House in central Pest before the curfew period ended at 5 p.m. Given the degree of dispersion and the temporal limits placed on Jewish access to public space in the city, Jews were limited in how far they could go and therefore where they could go, although I think it varied according to where you lived in the city, certainly worse for those living in the periphery. Now, confined to apartment buildings, initially for 21 hours a day, fearful of being exposed to abuse on the streets, and also limited, physically limited in some ways as to where you could go. There was, in the summer and fall of 1944, a turn inwards, a shrinking of living space for Budapest Jews. The individual apartment building became the operational scale at which day-to-day life was lived. Outside of their apartments, survivors recall the courtyards, stairways, internal balconies, and rooftops as crucial sites of exchange with Jews and non-Jews. TK, when I interviewed him in London, told me of days playing bridge with other teenagers sitting on the internal balcony overlooking the courtyard. Judith Brody told me that after dark we dragged chairs out into the corridor that ran the length of the building. Parents on the third floor discussing the day's events, the state of the war, and other important issues. Children on the second floor. Peter Tarjan, who was an 8-year-old boy at the time, recalled replacing his usual play space of the street with the stairways and internal balconies of their 7-story apartment building, which became the setting for games of cowboys and Indians. But within apartment buildings scattered across Budapest, there were not only intense interactions between Jews in the summer and early fall of 1944, but also between Jews and non-Jews because of this last-minute concession to allow non-Jewish tenants to stay living in the ghetto houses. Now, the continuing presence of non-Jews in ghetto houses radically reframes our understanding of ghettoization as segregation. Here's a critical difference between ghettoization in Budapest and ghettoization in a city like Warsaw. It was not just that in Budapest ghettoization was dispersed in the summer and autumn of 1944, but it was also that the enacting of ghettoization at the scale of the individual apartment meant that the so-called Aryan side in Budapest was in many cases just the apartment next door or up the stairs. Now, on paper, those apartments were out of bounds to Jews, but the policing of this was effectively an internal manner, depending in very large part upon the role played by the building's caretaker, the Hausmeister, and by non-Jewish neighbours who remained in their apartments. It would seem from survivor testimony that social networks between Jews and non-Jews within these mixed houses was really important during the summer and fall of 1944. Given the late onset, the swift timescale, and the surprising nature of ghettoization in Budapest, pre-existing social networks were particularly important. And the result was that whether Jews stayed put because their apartment was included in a ghetto building or were forced to move to another building was of crucial importance. Whether ghettoization meant dislocation or staying put mattered to Jews in all sorts of ways. Not only did staying put mean you could hang on to your furniture, to your supplies of groceries, to avoid the trauma of forced relocations, and it's clear that that mattered. Staying put also meant that you stayed within a local network of contacts, both within the building and in the close vicinity of the building. Interviewing a survivor from Budapest, Judith Brody, I was struck by her response to what she saw as my naive question about whether it mattered that her family was able to stay put in their own apartment. As she told me, staying put meant everything. It wasn't so much that she stayed put in a physical and material space, but within a social space. Because staying put meant that pre-war social contacts could be maintained, and in a sense, in 1944, contacts were absolutely everything. For Brodie, particularly important was the contact her mother had built up over many long years with a stall owner in the market who kept food behind for her. But it was also the man next door, a non-Jew who helped the family by arranging for Judith to escape to the countryside to spend the summer of 1944 living in Debrecen, pretending to be the daughter of the caretaker, the Hausmeister, who they also had a strong relationship with. Now, the importance of physical distance that emerges from mapping out walking distances like these is something that I do want to finish by just providing some kind of caution to. They do suggest in some ways that, as I've said, that dispersed ghettoization was something that affected Jews differently, that meant that Jews were removed from each other and from different resources. But in a sense, the problem with any kind of mapping like this, any kind of model like this, is that it can show us where Jews could go in the city, but it can't show us where Jews did go in the city. It's a representation. It's a simplification of what we all know as historians is a far more complex reality. And that's maybe one kind of closing caveat that I'd have as I try and think about the implications of some of this more recent work that I've done with Alberto. Now, whilst it works in the general, it suggests how far a Jew could get within 30 minutes. It doesn't work in a particular that included Jews drawing upon social networks of non-Jews, or risking it by just going out into the streets without a yellow star outside of the curfew. Mapping can show us where Jews could physically go, but it cannot show us, and never will be able to, where Jews did go. And our mapping tends to treat Jews as an entirely homogeneous group, rather than acknowledging the significance of difference about class or about gender. Just to give one example, the importance of gender is something that's signaled by survivors who assumed that it was easier for Jewish women to leave their houses without the yellow star than for Jewish men, marked out by their circumcision and fearful of the so-called trouser test if they were caught on the streets outside the curfew hours. Models are generalizations. They describe a potential reality rather than an actual reality. But my sense is that models and other very different sources like survivor testimony taken together can work in promising ways. Quantitative and qualitative approaches and very different kinds of evidence have the potential, I think, to enrich each other and generate new research questions. Uncovering the extent of the invisible walls within this dispersed ghetto through spatial analysis has forced me to reread survivors' testimony in the context of the spatial patterns suggested by the model. It's triggered an attentiveness to the ways in which dispersed ghettoization separated Jews out from other Jews and placed an increased importance on the relationship between Jews and non-Jews within the apartment building as social space. Moreover, the context provided by GIS mapping helps to better understand the significance and the importance of both Jewish and non-Jewish attempts to breach the limitations of physical distance that this map suggests. Rather than quantitative and qualitative methodologies being opposed, they have, I think, the potential for meaningful exchange, with historical GIS potentially being a useful element to our consideration. In a sense, what I want to suggest is that, though I started with that quote from Friedman back from 1960, and it's something that I still hold very dear to my heart, I think there is a real place for historians to take ghetto maps seriously as text to be analysed as part of uncovering the story of ghettoization. But I think there's also a place maybe for historians to start making maps. There's the potential for visualising largely textual data, because it may be that in visualising largely textual data, we start to understand a little bit more of the context in which some of the textual data or the oral histories make a little bit more sense. It might force us to ask new questions about ghettoization, about the importance of the apartment building as social space. It might lead us to new understandings of ghettoization. In Budapest, I think the ghetto was about concentration, but I think the ghetto as segregation worked in these multiple and ambiguous kinds of ways in the summer and autumn of 1944. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions.
I've just a small question. I do not remember if you mentioned it. This expression of yellow star houses, is this a contemporary expression or is it yours?
It's a contemporary expression. So Jews themselves are marked, their bodies are marked with a yellow star.
Yes.
And then this is also applied to the buildings that they live in. So it becomes a kind of shorthand that's used within the press, it's used by survivors. So they're often called yellow star houses.
It was not the official expression, it's just a...
That's right, it's just
used.
The language of the street,
Yes,
really,
okay.
yeah, in this period.
A quick question on my side until the ice breaks. What you call, I mean, I had another idea while you were talking, is what you call dispersed ghettoization. Could there be kind of an explanation for the very low resistance of the ghettos? I mean, the concentration in Warsaw was Jews all together, and this communication kind of hindered the ghetto inhabitants to resist or to... Could it be, or is it just a wrong approach from my side?
Yeah, I mean, I think that should be taken into consideration as part of understanding the experience of Hungarian Jews, is that this is a Jewish community that's had its young men largely removed by this point and increasingly removed, prior to deportation. So it's largely a community where there aren't any men between the ages of 18 and 49, especially in the later parts of Hungary that are deported in Western Hungary. I think the dispersion does mean that Jews are crucially separated out from each other and are living within these micro ghettos, removed from the normal kinds of rumors and potential for knowledge exchange. I mean, I think also in some ways, I wonder if, one of the things that happens in Hungary, in the places that I've looked at, and this isn't true everywhere, but I think in Torna, in Budapest, certainly, there's an attempt to try and ensure that ghettoization doesn't negatively impact non-Jews. And that means that the ghetto comes to the Jew, rather than the Jew being taken to the ghetto. There's a sense in that, I think, in which that's a more normal experience. So if you think about that house in Torna Utsa, the one family stay living in their house. The thing that's abnormal about what's happening now is that you share this house with 3 other families. But in some ways, there's a sense in which that's not as disruptive, I don't think, as being taken somewhere else. That I think survivors do talk very differently about staying put or moving to the ghetto in terms of an experience of trauma. The dislocation, the removal to the ghetto, was often seen as this very traumatic event. I remember there's a survived testimony I read recently where she talks about the armchair aristocracy, who are Jews who never moved as a result of ghettoization in Budapest because their houses were in the 7th district of Pest, and they stayed there when it was made into a Yellow Star house, and then they stayed there where it was made into the Pest ghetto, and so they had their armchair, because that was the one thing you couldn't carry. I mean, you couldn't carry much. And so they were people sitting in their armchair with a sense of having this kind of privileged position, the armchair aristocracy. And I do wonder whether there's a sense in which some of these dispersed patterns of ghettoization have a degree of greater normality to them. But I think probably the other side of the story in Hungary is about speed, and it's about Hungarian Jewish attitudes and perceptions of the state. So I think you'd want to bring all of those things together. But I do wonder whether space is part of the story that we don't maybe look at, enough.
As far as I know, there were special protected houses for Jews under the protection of the Swedish or Swiss embassy. I would understand that they have all been in the international ghetto. Is this correct? Yeah. Only in District 5?
Yeah, that's right. This is the central place. Although you find other places around the city which are used as small legation buildings where Jews are housed, but the majority is within District 5 in this so-called international ghetto.
Thank you very much for that detailed and differentiated image of Jewish living conditions in Budapest. There are, I think, many new findings which can be applied to other places and situations of the persecution of Jews in that period too. I have, nevertheless, because of these important findings, I have 2 major questions, I think. One is, what is the real advantage of applying geographic information systems besides representing this in a very impressive way. I mean, I must say, from that distance here, it was often couldn't be deciphered properly. But the problem is, I have the feeling that in some way the wheel is going to be rediscovered. Historians in earlier periods and in other, maybe other than American or British contacts, very often have been trained as teachers for history and geography. And another bunch of historians was trained mainly as historians and Germanists. So that established, I think, in many European scientific cultures, different patterns of historians. If you are, as a school teacher, I mean, that influences also the doing of the academic, of the university historians. If you are trained as a geographer, it's quite natural that you consider the space, not just mathematized that it is happening nowadays, but consider space. What is the unique advantage of applying such a high formalized geography, which is based on complex computing and mathematical formulas? What is the real advantage of this? What you couldn't find out also by just drawing maps or by having detailed descriptions according to houses, people living together. Just like anthropology also did this all the time. You might know Ivar Oxal from Hull, who did similar studies, not mathematics, computer using, but for Vienna. But what is the specific advantage of I mean, given the high technical, financial, manpower input, what is the real advantage of these formalized methods? And the other is very brief. The other question is it really useful to expand the concept of ghetto so much that you include in the concept of ghetto also this kind of virtual ghettos, of ghettos, of that kind of dispersed ghettos. If this is done, the meaning of ghetto is losing its central original meaning, content. I'm hesitating. If you look at this, also there was a ghetto in Vienna. I call this half ghettos in the second 20th district, for instance, which was also constructed or coming because of just other than deportation means, just by abandoning the renters' protection laws for Jews, but not for non-Jews. This had a similar concentrating effect, and in the late phases of, and in the early 40s, 41, 42, I think, that's just a guess, similar situations occurred already in Vienna 3 years earlier than in Budapest. But using the term of ghetto in the proper sense, isn't this too much expanded?
Yeah, maybe on the second question, I think one thing you find is there's a real difference between the work of Dan Mitchman from Yad Vashem and of Raoul Hilberg's, late Raoul Hilberg's original work. What Hilberg talks about in his magisterial study is ghettoization as a process, and within that, Vienna would be a place where ghettoization as process takes place, as would be Berlin and the Western European cities that we never imagine as having a ghetto. Because for Hilberg, ghettoization as process is about housing restrictions. So it's not so much about creating a closed Jewish space, but it's about a series of housing restrictions. So the idea, I think, of ghettoization as process is one that I think you can see in many places across Europe. And I think Hilberg is convincing in talking about ghettoization as process as a much more widespread phenomena. Where Mitchman would differ is that Mitchman focuses much more on ghetto as place. And for Mitchman, ghetto as place is not just about housing restrictions, it's about segregated, concentrated living spaces for Jews, separated out from non-Jews. And what I think you see in Hungary is that as far as the contemporary national legislation goes, every single dispersed house is a ghetto. That's the way the Hungarian authorities perceive each of these dots on a map, is that they see these as concentrated, segregated Jewish living spaces. So they definitely see them as ghetto. But I think where Mitchman's work is important is that it's saying we need to look at ghettoization again in Europe, because actually ghettos look really different in all sorts of different places, that we maybe take the Polish, some of the most famous of the Polish examples, as the kind of typical story of what a ghetto is. And yet actually there's much more considerable diversity. When you look in, say, Ukraine, occupied Ukraine, ghettos look very different. When you look at Hungary, in 44, ghettos look different. And I think the reason I use the word ghetto is because the local, the contemporary municipal officials use the word ghetto. So they called it a ghetto, so I call it a ghetto. But what I'm saying is actually it's a really unusual kind of ghetto, especially in Budapest, where it's individual apartments, not just apartment buildings, that is the state at which segregation takes place. And I think that the thing about that is that then it's so difficult to police that kind of segregation, which is, it's hard enough to police 1900 houses. It's really hard to police thousands and thousands of apartments within those 1900 houses where Jews and non-Jews have potential for exchange. And I've got a PhD student at the moment who's looking at Hausmeister, these building managers, these caretakers, and looking at their role, because I think they really did have a critical role in experiences within this period. GIS, the project that we've been involved in, Alberto and I, was a project which was about testing a methodology. So we got funding to do something which was innovative and new, to see whether it worked or not, to see whether it had any value or not. It does take a lot of time, because it's about entering these individual points into a computer, into a database, and then linking it in with a historical map, which you need to georectify, and then you kind of create these layers. But I think it may be worth some of that time and effort. What we've done is we've done this project. It's been part of a larger research group. I've been working on Budapest with Alberto. We've had colleagues working on Auschwitz, on the Wehrmacht involvement in killings in the occupied East in 41 and 42, on the evacuations from Auschwitz in 1945. And I think all of us feel that visualizing data it looks different. The thing I think as a historian in some ways, we can argue in some ways about whether it's worth the several $100,000 that it costs to do the research. But the thing that all of us have found is that actually by visualizing textual sources, you see something that you can't see when you have all the textual sources. Because I think that's the real challenge as a historian, is in some ways, you read so much, especially contemporary historians, you read thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. And the thing that's useful, I think, about GIS is it suddenly starts to put them together in ways that you've maybe never thought about before. And so for me, in my work, it's really suggested a new way of thinking about ghettoization in Budapest as a ghetto that doesn't really move its center of gravity. There's no way that I could see that without going through the process of weighting these buildings, because in my earlier mapping, I was drawn into the dots on the map rather than thinking about those differences. What I think is something I haven't shown you, one of the things that we've done quite a lot of work on is on bystander gaze. And I think this is one of the things where I think GIS does potentially offer something, which is that I think it creates a source in some ways. So from a series of wartime sources, you create something which doesn't exist until you create the GIS. And I think with bystanders, I think bystanders are the most difficult group to work with because they leave the least paper trace. We don't really have the oral histories of many bystanders, and we don't have the documents like we have for the perpetrators. And what I think has been interesting is there's a whole series of visuals that we've done, which is to show, for example, if you ride the tram in Budapest in 44, how visible are Jewish houses to you as a bystander? So how visible is the ghetto? to Jews, non-Jews within this city. When the Jews are going to their market halls at 2 o'clock in the initial period after the curfew, where are Jews in the city? Where are the potential for exchange that take place within the city? So I think there's a sense in which I think for bystanders, this may be one of the most pertinent things. Just another couple of examples. One of the things that one of our group has done is been looking at Auschwitz, the building of Auschwitz. And there they've created a GIS of Auschwitz. And what it suggests is that there's a critical phase in Auschwitz where Auschwitz is a construction site, which I think we've kind of known about, but actually becomes much more visual when you create a GIS. You suddenly see a moment where Auschwitz is basically a big building site. And survivors' testimony then makes sense. There's so many survivors that talk about this process of building in Auschwitz, but you suddenly see that actually if you're a guard in Auschwitz, your sight lines are hindered in many ways by this construction camp phase, which is the phase when the escapes from Auschwitz take place. And I think this work is suggesting a kind of different chronology to understanding our chronology of Auschwitz. Another is in mapping out the Einsatzgruppen killings in the east. We've just done it on one region, but I think what it suggests is a much more chaotic pattern than we ever assumed in terms of the way that the Einsatzgruppen killings take place. So I think it really is a big effort. It's an expense of time. It needs interdisciplinary collaboration, but I think it has the potential to suggest new changes. Wait and read the book. So there's a book coming out of Indiana University Press next year called Geographies of the Holocaust, and it's the results of all of this work. It'll have all of the visuals, and it's really a book which is kind of throwing that out, I think, to the field to say, is there a value to doing these kinds of things?
One thing, I'm confessing I'm also a historian, not only a historian, but also a geographer and a computer applicant. But the main question remains, if you consider that dispersed living conditions, as you describe it here in Budapest, it must have been so different from the living conditions of Jews in the, as I would like to say, proper ghettos. So that I have still strong hesitations if it's useful to use the same descriptive term ghetto for both situations. Nothing against the term of ghettoization. This is a process which begins and doesn't necessarily reach the same end point. But if you use the same term, isn't this diminishing the supposed strong differences between these two types of living conditions for Jews?
Yeah, I think it's a good, my sense is we use the same term, but we're really careful to say actually ghettos look really different in different places. So in Warsaw, you can't, I think that's the danger sometimes, isn't it, within, say, a popular telling of the Holocaust. So if you go through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, in a sense, they have to create a single linear narrative, which is that all Jews lived in the Warsaw Ghetto and then were deported to Auschwitz. And we know that Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto weren't deported to Auschwitz, and they have the photographs of the Hungarian deportees. The Hungarian deportees that arrived at Auschwitz included Jews that lived in these kinds of ghettos, which were very different, short-lived, and of a very different nature to the Warsaw Ghetto and the Jews that were deported to Treblinka. And I think that's the problem, it may be, is that Warsaw emerges as our classic ghetto, Auschwitz emerges as our classic camp, and actually what we know, as soon as you read any survivor testimony, is that people had really different experiences. And I think that's to me, that's what we do as historians, is talk about complexity, is to try and say, actually, it looked really different from place to place. And I say, one of the big things I'm really interested in is that I think it looked different for different Jews in the same place, because it really mattered in Budapest if you stayed put or you had to move, because of this idea of social space. And survivors, Judith Brody, when I asked her, she thought I was stupid to even ask the question, because she said, of course everyone knows. It mattered enormously. And then out she came with the sense in which how she felt that this had so shaped her own individual experience. So I would say ghettos differed. Individual Jewish experiences within ghettos differed as well. And that we should be really careful to say that and not to assume, like Warsaw, when we use the language of ghetto.
From reading survivors' testimonies, I found out that there were basically two sorts of ghettos in Hungary, particularly outside of Budapest. Budapest is a case of its own. But you have first the ghettos that you were talking about, but later on the concentration points near the train stations, the brick factories, and I found out that in the experience of the survivors, these were the really traumatic ghettos, and they come very close to what we consider as a ghetto, if you can consider any open building like a brick factory, a ghetto, or anything at all. So I wanted to ask you how you are looking at this second kind of ghetto, or this second kind of dislocation.
Yeah, and I think it's something that comes through very strongly in survivor testimony, like, as you know. I mean, that is often the traumatic moment, the most traumatic moment, because it's not residential space. It doesn't look like an apartment. It's a brick factory, which no one lives in, and no one can conceptualize or conceive of living there. And the conditions are terrible. And I think that's one of the kind of crucial moments of dislocation for Hungarian Jews, is that point where these individual ghettos are emptied and taken to these entrainment points, where often generally non-residential space is used, and from there, then there's often rapid deportation to Auschwitz. And I think that's one thing you find in the Hungarian case is outside of Budapest. I mean, in Budapest, because the ghetto shifts, there's an experience of dislocation. For most people, apart from the armchair aristocracy in the Pest ghetto, but for most people, the Holocaust is this experience of dislocation, at least dislocation. And what I found from the provinces is that sometimes you find the sense that someone who has already had to move the first time, for them it's just the second move, although to worse conditions. For someone who stays put the first time, it's much more dramatic, because it's the first period of dislocation from their home, from the space that is Heimat, that has a kind of, it's not just physical, is it? It's everything. So I think that's one thing that emerges, and I think that's one thing that's important about survivor testimony is that sense of almost placing survivor testimony on the map, that you then start to understand a little bit at what points come the real trauma, of the experience.
Maybe just one more comment, if I may. Actually, in my opinion, the situation of the countryside ghettos in Hungary was much more complicated than that. So if you take Warsaw as an example, or a standard ghetto, as it was said, then we would say that there were ghettos in Hungary which were like this standard ghetto. I mean, a closed, fenced-off, very crowded place. However, there were very diverse patterns of ghettoization in Hungary, from the so-called open ghettos, which were not really fenced off, or in fact there were some towns in which there was no ghetto at all, from the scattered types which Tim has just presented to us, to places which were like a camp-like accommodation in an open forest, or pigsties, or whatever. So actually we can classify Hungarian ghettos in a very diverse way. And I think which is more important or more interesting for us is that it's a question also for Tim, that how Hungarian doctors of space, using Tim's term, considered this ghettoization. So really, I'm not very sure if all the local Hungarian mayors and other authorities considered the ghettoization as the prelude, immediate prelude to deportation, but many of them, in my opinion, considered it as a way of, social reconstructing of the town. So that's why in some places, for instance, they just moved back Jews from their apartments to an assigned Jewish quarter in the town. For instance, in Budapest, it was the so-called traditional Jewish quarter, the 7th district, and it was actually the very place where the Jews could first settle in the town. But actually that was the same story in Debrecen and many other cities, that simply the local leadership thought that they should put the Jews back to their place. I mean, to the place where they originally were allowed to settle. So, and I think it's a completely different approach to those decision makers who immediately put the Jews to the pigsties and to the brick factory because they are sure that in a couple of weeks they would be removed. But it was not the case in every locality. And I'm very curious about Tim's opinion on that, of course.
I mean, as you know, that's something I've written about as well, that I think in lots of places, I mean, you find this in Budapest, in lots of places, ghettoization is not seen as an immediate prelude to deportation by local officials. And often it's about a clash of timescales, so that there's a sense in which, certainly in Budapest, you get this clash of timescales between the local authorities and the national authorities, that the local authorities think that ghettoization can stretch out for 3 months. The national authorities say no, deportation needs to take place before that. You know, deportation is planned for Budapest before that. And I think you find that story elsewhere, that at the local level, and this is important, I think, because it means that local officials get some national legislation and they apply it, but they actually see a ghetto in a very different term about whether it's a short-term measure or a medium to long-term measure. That many of them see it as this is the chance to solve the Jewish question in the city, and I think that's what is happening in May 1944 with the original plans in Budapest, is that this is about a longer-term cleansing of the city and a kind of putting of Jews in certain places, and a bit of that is about geostrategy. It's putting Jews close to places which are targets for bombs in 1944, but it's a kind of longer term, it's a longer vision of what a ghetto looks like, and you get this kind of moment, I think, in May 1944, where a kind of longer term, medium term thinking at the locality is superseded by a much more rapid set of thinking from the top down. And there's, in Budapest, you get a kind of clash of opinion about this that takes place at the end of May 1944. And I think that that's one thing that I think is important about the Hungarian story, is that, you know, the last thing I don't think the Hungarian story is a kind of teleological story of, you know, I guess the danger of Hilberg's model is that it's about ghettoization followed by deportation. And I think the thing that I'd want to do in Hungary is I want to disconnect those in lots of places. And that's only a story you find as you look in the local archives, that you start to get a kind of disconnecting of that story and that it's a far more complex story. And I think, like Lotzi says, the thing that's interesting then is to ask, well, why are these people creating a ghetto? What do they think a ghetto means? Like, what's their perception or conception of a ghetto? Why separate Jews? Where do you separate Jews? Do you put them in residential or non-residential property? Do you put them where they traditionally lived or not? Do you put them in the heart of the city or the periphery of the city? What are the kinds of ideas about the Jew and about the ghetto that emerge within these localities? And that's where I think, you know, in some ways what we need is kind of study of all of these ghettos, to, you know, kind of detailed study to try and enrich our understanding of this diversity. And then I think what you see is you see a series of local officials that are operating in very different ways. You know, and Lotzi's done some of that work for one county, a couple of counties in Hungary. And I think it's ongoing work, you know, that other scholars will hopefully pick up on.
Just one question. Do you really think that the start of the deportation in May did not have an influence on decision-making of ghettos in the heartland of Hungary or in other parts of Hungary? I mean, you want to segregate, to disconnect it to events, but I don't really see how.
I mean, I think in Budapest, what's interesting is probably get two things happening. So May 1944, the early plans in May 1944 are very utopian. The plans in June are much more pragmatic. But what seems to happen in Budapest is there's a shift at the end of May where finally the news comes down to the local officials that you kind of just do ghettoization quickly, because ghettoization is a temporary measure. And if it's a temporary measure, then in a sense you go for the easiest option, which is to basically put ghettos where Jews are, rather than moving Jews to ghettos. But I think that happens relatively late in the case of Budapest, that information is fed down to the local officials. And I think that is what is really striking, because prior to that, local officials have got plans for ghettos, which are kind of grander plans about a kind of reshaping of the Jewish problem in Budapest, without thinking that it's about deportation. But they still have kind of plans which are quite clearly to give Jews less space, less high quality space, less prestigious space, and to reshape the entire city. And I think that's what I'm interested in some ways, this idea of doctors of space, is that I do think that at the local level you can see arguments that cities need to be cleansed of Jews, and that ghettoization is a way in which you do that, you know, a kind of physical, spatial cleansing of Jews.
No. I close the floor. I think we all can go on in the discussion personally. I want to thank you for this highlight. It's the moments when I know what my profession is about. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. I forgot to show you this photograph, as you all can see, and you can find all the books of Tim Cole in the wonderful library of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, and you're invited to visit us. And I invite you for the next Simon Wiesenthal lecture, which is on March 22nd with Sigmund Baumann. Thank you very much for coming, and I think the floor is open for private discussions now here in the room. Thank you very much.